Welcome to the update presented by Kandji. To those of you here that are joining us live in San Francisco, and also to those that are tuning into the live stream from around the world, welcome. We're glad that you're here with us. The update is an opportunity to bring together experts in Apple IT and security to have discussions about topics of the day. We're interested in creating a space for the community to gather, to meet, to learn, and to grow together. Today we're going to talk about two events that have happened just recently in the San Francisco Bay Area: Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference and the RSA Security Conference. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. We have Ben Baharin, CEO and Principal Analyst of Creative Strategies; Kat Self, Mac and Linux Lead and CTI Lead at MITRE ATT&CK Evaluation; Patrick Wardle, the founder of Objective-C; and Mike Boylan, staff product engineer at Kandji. Thanks to all of them for joining us. So we've had these two conferences. We'd like to get your thoughts on both of them, but let's start with WWDC, Apple's event throughout this week, starting with the keynote. So I'll open it up to the panel. What announcements from this week from Apple caught your attention?
I'll start. There were so many announcements, but things that really excited me, focusing on sort of MDM being at Kandji, were things like declarative device management, remote attestation for iOS devices and tvOS devices, mandatory macOS enrollment into MDM, which I think will be huge for so many folks. Platform SSO, like the list just goes on and on. Plus all the consumer features, right? Like the new window management capabilities that I think have been a little bit long overdue into macOS. So really excited about that.
Cool, we hit a list there. What other thoughts are there from the panel?
Yeah, I was really excited about some of their security announcements. So the rapid mechanism to push out security updates I thought was really neat. That's something that I think will make it harder for the adversaries and the hackers, which is always a good thing. They also kind of expanded some of the endpoint security framework to add new events, which is really great for third-party security tools and vendor creators. So those were, I think, were both really exciting. And one other thing I think that's neat too is just some more of the controls they're adding to the operating system. So now, when you plug in a USB device, you're going to have to provide, user approval for that. And there's some people like, why that? And in previous life, there were some mechanisms you could just walk up to a locked computer, plug in a USB device, and gain access. And with these new security features, that won't work anymore. So it's really nice to see Apple really stepping up their game, raising the bar, and ultimately providing more mechanisms to protect end users.
Yeah, and USB restricted mode it's been on iOS for a year or two, and now it's coming to the Mac for Apple Silicon, which is really exciting.
Definitely.
Yeah. So on the attack team, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with attack, basically, it's the knowledge base of adversary behavior. And one of the biggest struggles that we've had is like, how do we provide, like, data sources has been a huge effort over this last year on like, where do you look on Mac to find these adversary behaviors? Like, how do we empower the enterprises to be able to find that information? And so I'm super excited that we have the endpoint security framework tooling. Of course, now that I'm on camera, I cannot remember the name.
ESF Logger.
ESF Logger. Thanks, Patrick.
You're welcome. I gotcha.
So, but since we have the ESF Logger, because one of the biggest problems was how, like, we can give you the events, but then you have to have your own client-based tool to be able to pull these events. And like, you'll actually see on some of the different data sources where like, and there's block that Patrick Wardle has. So it's just not a great solution. So I'm really excited that they now have a tool that is deployed, a part of the actual operating system that we can have and empower users and enterprises to be able to actually find these events, look at them, and then be able to find those behaviors themselves.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was the M2. I mean, my background life, I started this industry in silicon and semiconductors, and so I could spend a whole long time just geeking out on some of the things that they do. But as we've tracked Apple through the years, and it goes on 20 years for me studying them as a company and what they do, the silicon bit I think is one of the things that's put them on the trajectory that they're on in almost every category, whether that's just what they're doing all the way through the stack, through the innovations in silicon, the hardware, the software, tying that to services. It's really all related to what they're doing in silicon. And, we used to look at it and say, Apple's got 2 legs, then 3 legs, then 4 legs, and I think the silicon is really that root, that stem foundation that all of their trajectory is on. So I was excited to see that. I mean, I kind of suspected it. We had heard some rumors they were going to launch M2, and we had been speculating what's going to be different with M2 from M1. But this whole conversation, especially around why is Apple now well positioned in the enterprise, specifically with Macs, is really based around Apple silicon. They can just do things they could not do previously on Intel silicon. So that excited me. It's the momentum that they're on. So I was glad to see some details that fit some of the things I thought was going to happen, or my predictions, and then some things that were surprises. So.
Yeah. I happened to be on campus for that keynote, and when they announced M2, that was one of the loudest cheers from the crowd that day. Mm-hmm. As I think most of us use Mac as our daily driver, and it's a platform that we invest in, that M2 has been, I think, a real driver to enterprise adoption. We've seen that growing over the years, but it's accelerated now that the hardware has a really clear performance advantage as well. But as we shift our focus to some of the enterprise implications, right, adoption across the enterprise, and these features that Apple are announcing, Mike, I wanted to ask you about declarative management. So this is something that Apple introduced last year, but they've followed up with some interesting new features.
Yeah, not only new features, but I think the most exciting thing for all of us managing devices is that it's no longer just scoped to user enrollment on iOS. They've expanded declarative device management to every enrollment type on every platform that is supported. So tvOS, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, whether it's a profile-based device enrollment, automated device enrollment, user enrollment, all of those methodologies can take advantage of declarative device management. And I think why that matters so much, why it's so important, is a lot of folks probably don't realize this, but the mobile device management protocol that a lot of us are using today has been around since iOS 4, right? And so Apple's done a really great job of building in new payloads and features into the protocol, but it's been around for a really long time. And so declarative device management sort of turns the entire idea on its head and results in far less back and forth communication between server and client, and really lets the client drive most of the logic. So the MDM system can say, here are all the configurations and policies that this device should have, and it can react immediately to any changes that drift from that desired state on the device. Whereas today, MDM has to go and query the device and see if something's changed, and then reissue a command to adjust for that state drift. So it's a huge shift. To Weldon's point, last year it was really limited in scope, but now instead of just adding one additional platform, they said, okay, it's available for everything. So I know we're really excited to start digging in and see how we can take advantage of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see that technology move from iOS to the rest of the platforms and across different enrollment methods. Something else that was introduced this year just on iOS is device attestation. And it's brand new, and we're still learning details about it. Yep. But Patrick, do you mind if I ask you just to speak to the importance of device attestation at a high level?
Yeah, so I like to think about it kind of from the attacker's perspective. They're always looking for ways to kind of masquerade in as something that they're not, a way into a network or something like that. And with this new attestation, right, the server can basically say, hey, you're not a device that I trust. And I think anytime you can build a better client-server device relationship, it kind of hardens or limits the attack surface. So I haven't really dug into all the details, but I think the idea of it is really powerful, and I know it will make the job more difficult for hackers. I don't know if you have more to add to that, or... No,
I think that the fact that it's bundled into sort of the device management capabilities and protocol makes it just something will hopefully be easier for people to adopt, therefore easier to get that stronger security posture by taking advantage of it.
Yeah, and I like when Apple starts baking these things in, right?
Yeah.
Because when it's a periphery option, opt-in stuff, like, okay, that's a good step in the right direction. But once it's baked in, it's going to be widespread, like you said, then it can be leveraged almost universally, and you just kind of then get this additional security almost for free, which is a really powerful thing. So kudos to Apple for that.
Built into the OS, but also built into the hardware through the secure enclave.
Exactly.
So that cryptographic material that's used to identify the device can also be used for other things like TLS, so that you know that, hey, this communication channel, I'm actually talking to the same device that enrolled earlier, things like that. So exciting things to come there. There's also some new tooling around single sign-on. And so I'll open up to whoever wants to jump in, but how is identity and security related here, and how does single sign-on and Apple's improvements there, how does that affect the enterprise?
So I think the biggest takeaway was, well, there's two pieces. The first one on Mac is Platform SSO, which is this incredible ability to essentially have single sign-on all the way from the login window into your identity provider. And so this has been a long-standing request, and there's lots of tools out there that allow you to sign into your Mac and then authenticate to your identity provider and then use single sign-on from there. But integrating that natively into the macOS login window so that you log in one time and then it passes all the way through, in addition to being able to get Kerberos tickets as well, really powerful. And then on iOS for user enrollment, the flow to enroll that lets you download a single sign-on application, log in through the identity provider, and that also enrolls your device into management for user enrollment, that's also brand new and super, super powerful too. So I think that blend of bringing identity closer and more available to the user up front to let you into your device is awesome.
Yeah. Kat, I'm curious about your perspective on the attack side, right? Identity in the enterprise, how is this important to security?
I feel like I hate nervousness. I mean, I'm going to think about it from the attack perspective.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about it from all the different avenues. One of the things that they brought up was the passphrase, or the passcode. So my mind just automatically goes to the different techniques that we're probably going to be adding once someone actually publishes something that actually goes on how threat actors abuse it.
Yeah.
But as far as the significance from an attacker's perspective, no, I think I'm going to second what Patrick said. Like, I think the way that Apple's approached it, baking it in, and second what everyone else has said is that they're heading the right direction. So I really like seeing how it's evolving and how it's come across, because it's actually solving a lot of problems before they even get to them, the way they bundle everything in together.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that. And you think about what SSO solves, it's just really addresses a lot of issues that resolve around passwords, right? And so I think this is probably built into attack as well. The initial vectors people get in, phishing, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, SSO, when done right, can essentially obliterate that. And I think that's really powerful. And when it's baked into the operating system, again, it almost closes down that attack vector fully. I mean, there's always going to be edge cases, and it's never perfect, but it's really cool to see kind of Apple do that. And exactly like Kat said, it can then stop a lot of attacks, because phishing might be phase one, and then if that's successful, they can do some real damage. But if that's kind of shut down because the user, like you mentioned, logs in once, and then that identity is pushed forward, and so they don't even have to worry about putting in additional passwords. Phishing attempts should, in theory, fail, or at least the user detect them. And so I think, exactly like you said, that should stop some of the problems even before they start, which is really where you want to stop them.
Yeah. Speaking of passwords, I mean, Apple recently announced they're joining an alliance, the FIDO-Key Alliance, right, for passwordless, and we saw I think the first implementation of that maybe with Safari and using passkeys to authenticate to websites through there. Ben, any additional thoughts about identity and the enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I had been longly, predicting that Macs would go on a growth spurt for the enterprise, and kind of every year, like, my thesis was there, and then taking some time, and finally it feels like we're at that stage. These conversations we're having with a whole host of IT decision makers and folks in security that we're getting like closer to them checking off some of those boxes that were the barriers to full adoption. I mean, again, Macs are still not on the menu the same way that Windows machines are, but I think we're getting to a tipping point where we might see that become a lot more common, which I think is good. But when we look at it, I think what's intriguing is the way, we've talked about how these things get baked down into the operating system level. Again, they get brought down into the silicon level. Is with everything Apple does, whether that's a feature like continuity camera, which is super interesting if you've seen it, all the way down to just how all your devices work together. They control the entire stack, and they do that with every level of the experience, especially when it comes from consumer, but they're also bringing that approach to the enterprise, which I think is interesting. And again, I think that's because of what they're doing in silicon. I sort of joke with people that it was the timing in which they shift from Intel to Apple Silicon that they could now go at this deeper level. So I was just sort of always like, well, they're just waiting, right? They're enterprise moment, they're just waiting so they can get rid of Intel, and so now we're sort of here. But if you think about the way that they do really seek to integrate, relatively intentional, I think, in all of their approaches. Not everything's always perfect, but they are trying to focus on ease of use, usability, all of the things that bring that experience, but it's because they control that whole stack. And so whatever it is, whether it's just the passkey management, identity, all of the security things that we're seeing drive a lot of reasons why enterprises are starting to gravitate toward the Mac is mostly security in terms of that checkbox. So it steps in the right direction. Again, I still think there's other hurdles they still have to cross over in order to get fully on the menu and move their sales from 30 to 40, 50 million units, which I think is completely possible. But it's a step, right? Every year they're a little bit more methodical. They don't do it all at once. They take their time. They take this approach. But again, it comes back to that whole stack, which I think is interesting, whether that's consumer or enterprise features.
So one thing I picked up on, I wanted to revisit, maybe dive into, is we're talking about the motivations that enterprises had to adopt Apple within their organization, and it seems like you're suggesting that security was near the top of that list.
Yeah, security is by far where you're seeing more. Let's just say the reason that the enterprises are adopting them, and we've seen demand from employees for a long time. I mean, every survey that we've done, that goes north of 60% where the employees say that they want Macs to be on the menu. So the drive is there. Like, humans that work at workplaces want there to be Macs, like in hordes. But for IT, right, it's always been, well, sometimes it's a knowledge base, right? Sometimes they're dealing with Active Directory, which is a legacy system. And so some of these things just need to be reinvented. And I think we are, like, modern IT is going to look really, really different than it did when I was at Cypress Semiconductor, back in the day. And so I think the check boxes that they just have to hit they're making progress with those, but there's still those barriers. But like I said, the good thing being that security, again, specifically because of M1, is one of the big reasons that we're seeing more willingness to say, okay, we're going to take this seriously. Again, we're going to roll it out slowly. We've now got management tools from you all and others, which is helping bridge those gaps and put them on equal footing with Windows from a management standpoint. But this isn't going to happen next year. This is still a multi-year path for us to get to where Apple's share could be 30, 40, 50% of the enterprise.
Do you want to make a comment? Jumping on actually what you said, something that we've really struggled with, and I struggle with as a researcher, is having a macOS platform that I can actually do testing on. That is not hardware. Like cloud versions, right? Like, I'm on the attack evaluations team, and one of the biggest struggles is, how do we have a cloud environment that has macOS in it that is not on AWS? Like, what does that look like? How do I automatically deploy this so then I can actually run these amazing tools that other people have for me, so I can test them out and see, what do my artifacts even look like? But no, I have to go buy a piece of hardware so that way I can actually look at this. Like, I literally have to go download beta on an actual Mac,
right,
and then I have to be able to look at that and then actually test it out myself versus spinning up a virtual environment to be able to actually figure out, so how is this going to look? And I think that's been one of the hardest things for adoption in some of the programs that I'm a part of, is because I just don't have a venue to be able to have an ease of use or be able to spin up a playbook that can automatically deploy something.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Well, there's a few challenges, right?
There's a lot of challenges. Yeah. There's a reason why it hasn't been solved yet. So
Apple
I understand.
likes it when you buy more hardware.
Yeah, I know.
Especially for testing purposes.
There are some improvements apparently in Ventura in terms of making VMs, so maybe they'll help things a little bit.
Yeah.
Apple knows that it needs to happen, I think. So.
Yeah, well, that's good. As long as they know. They'll probably charge you for it. So
Yeah, I'd pay.
I would too.
Well, great. I mean, it's certainly like an important question to answer. Like, not only does this device meet our needs, does it solve the problems, does it serve the user, but can we make sure it's secure in our environment? Do we have the tools? Do we have the testing platform? Everything else to validate that it's going to work for us? And that's that idea of tooling, right? And how to automate testing. That's a big focus of RSA. So maybe that's a good segue to transition to the other conference that happened here in San Francisco this week. There's a whole range of topics at a conference like that, from very technical deep dives and attack methods and other things, and some other topics like mental health and how to create a productive, healthy environment at work. And maybe I'll start with Patrick and Kat, because Patrick, you spoke at RSA, and Kat, I know you were there as well, representing MITRE. So what were your impressions from the show this year? What stood out to you?
You want to go first?
So I think the thing that really stood out to me is the macOS and Linux lead, because of course I get to a conference and I scour for all of the macOS and Linux talks, right? And there was two. There was two talks. I think there might have been like one Linux talk, but I couldn't actually confirm it. So I would say that was probably the biggest impression that I took away from it. But other than that, I love the fact that there's blended topics. I love the fact that they address so many different issues that our industry faces. So from mental health to actual technical talk to the cryptography. And I always hear raving reviews from people that actually understand all the different mathematical theories from the cryptography talks. But yes, Patrick Wardle's was the Monday talk, and then there was a Tuesday talk. So I'll let him talk about that one.
Yeah, I was also somewhat surprised because, as we're all here, we know Mac in the enterprise is fairly prolific, popular, and so you would expect that there would perhaps be more talks on the topic, but who knows? So I was talked a little bit about some Mac security issues that I think was really interesting. My talk basically focused on some neat bugs that were able to bypass Gatekeeper and Apple's notarization checks, which are really now foundational components of the operating system. And I did some root cause analysis on some neat bugs that basically would have allowed a remote attacker to bypass these in very, very trivial ways. They're basically logic flaws. When you're packaging up an application, the operating system would misclassify it and allow it to run even though it wasn't signed. And we saw attackers use these as zero-day vulnerabilities in the wild to target Mac users and also in the enterprise. So to me, that was interesting because it showed that adversaries are evolving, and for example, in this case, using zero-day vulnerabilities to bypass Apple's security mechanisms. The good news is that means Apple's security mechanisms are forcing them to evolve, so the bar is higher. But it was unfortunate once we looked into the root cause of these bugs, into how shallow they were in the operating system. One of the other bugs was found by a researcher inadvertently, by accident. He reached out to me and said, "This bypasses everything. I have no idea why. Let's dig." So to me, it also showed that while Apple is going in the right direction, there's a lot of legacy code. This was in the BSD code from probably the early 90s that was classifying scripts, right? If you built an application with a script and left off the interpreter, the operating system would run it, even if it wasn't signed. That's not good. And so I think it's just a good reminder that there's always opportunities for improvement. This is true of any operating system vendor. But also to me shows that having additional third-party security tools or tools that provide more insight into what the user is running is really beneficial because while Apple is improving, there's always going to be gaps and room for additional defense in depth built on top of that. So that to me was a good point to make and an important takeaway of the talk, which I think is important.
Well, and one of the points that you made about legacy, that this has constantly come up when we again talk about why our Mac's not being deployed more broadly at scale. And the two things that trend-wise are converging that I think is interesting is everybody knows with COVID we're sort of going through a rushed forward moment in time around digital transformation. So almost everybody is now rethinking the way in which they use cloud services, backends that their businesses are built on, and so that's becoming modernized, which I think will help now get over some of those legacy issues. So it won't be like, hey, I've got all this software running on whatever so and so somewhere. So the fact that they are doing digital transformation and that's coming in, and then the other was as a part of this, we continually heard from enterprises that basically security was the one area that just basically had a blank checkbook, that they could just go and write whatever they wanted. It was so important, so they were willing to invest and spend. And I think, again, that's what's causing this moment to reflect on every process, right? Because now that security is so involved with IT and these decisions they're making from everything that they run in the cloud down to local, you're seeing that align with this new moment of digital transformation. And so new questions are being asked that probably wouldn't have been asked 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that, again, opens up the opportunity for these alternate platforms. So it's not just not just Windows or not necessarily just Android in areas, but to have a much more diverse environment, whether, again, including Linux.
So I have a follow-up question for you. So in terms of Gatekeeper and XProtect, I've always kind of thought of those as being targeted at like the most prolific attacks.
Sure.
Is that accurate, fair statement? Or do you feel like the breadth of Gatekeeper and XProtect has expanded significantly?
I would agree with essentially half of that statement. So XProtect is basically macOS's built-in antivirus. It's signature-based, use YAR rules, and as you mentioned, it's used to basically block super prolific attacks. So if there's a piece of adware or malware that's really rapidly spreading, impacting a lot of Mac users, Apple will push out an update for that. And basically it then does a signature check against the files, and combined with MRT, which is Mac's malware removal tool, it can remove it from the system. So it's really Apple's like super basic AV product that's built into the operating system. And like you said, that's used in the really prolific attacks. Sometimes we don't know what it's protecting. Apple pushes out a signature, and if you're monitoring the XProtect Yara file, you can see a new Yara signature. But it's maybe matching a hash or some sequence of bytes. But you go on VirusTotal or talk to the AV companies. No one has any idea. Apple does. They don't tell you. So area of improvement, I think, is hey, let's all work together on this. They're getting better at that because obviously, I think the more knowledge we can share, that would be good. What Gatekeeper does, and combined now with notarization, is basically seeks to ensure that whatever users are running has been scanned and verified by Apple. Because if you look almost back to the beginning of macOS, the number one way users and now enterprise users are getting infected is not by advanced 0 days from nation states. I mean, that's happening, but it's very targeted. It's really users inadvertently running adware, pirated applications, essentially infecting themselves. And so Apple kind of had to do something to protect the user, basically, and protect their image. And so they deployed Gatekeeper, which is, okay, it has to be signed. Malware authors started signing their code with developer certificates. So they said, okay, we're going to do one step further, introduce notarization, which basically now means if you want to run something on macOS, you first have to send this compiled binary to Apple. They do some static and dynamic analysis. They don't see any malicious code. They then basically give it a stamp of approval. And I think that generically applies to all the malware, basically, and has done a really good job. I get like hackers sliding into my DMs being like, hey, how do I get around notarization? Because I can't hack people anymore.
That's good.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
That's the point.
That's bold.
I know, it's bold. So like, kudos. But so to me, that's a great confirmation that when a security mechanism is causing problems for the adversaries, it means it's a good thing. And it's not perfect, right? We've seen Apple inadvertently notarize adware, malware, but it also allows them to build this big corpus and learn from this. So of all the recent security mechanisms that I think impact macOS positively, the notarization I think is the best, and it's just going to continue to improve.
Well, and one of the things that I think is important when you think about what Apple deeply integrates into the platforms that they can control, right? Not from third parties, but their platforms, is because what was actually surprising to me in a lot of our research that we did recently is that there's a lot more Macs used in SMBs than I think anybody really realizes, and they generally don't protect these systems, nor do they really manage them, right? And so unfortunately, Apple has to take more of those things into their own hand because a lot of those companies are just like, oh, we didn't think we needed to manage them, or employee number 5 and 6 wanted Macs, and so here we go, we bought them at Best Buy, but they're not managed, right? And so I think that's one, it's the opportunity. It's why I think they're getting into Apple Business Essentials, is to try to bring something simple to those who didn't do it before, because I think they also didn't know how many Macs were used in SMB, and now they're seeing that. But that's where doing more of that on behalf of the user who may not be in a large enterprise where IT is taking care of that is just important. So more they do at that stack, I think helps, right? Just the average person or the average business.
Yeah. Yeah, and even last year, they introduced the ability, so that example of buying a device from Best Buy is great, because as long as it's Apple T2 security chip or Apple Silicon, as an organization, you can use Apple Configurator for iPhone and actually add it into your Apple Business Manager instance, and then you have the ability to enroll it into MDM solutions. So adds that additional layer. And then in Ventura, you've got this mandatory capability to make sure that every time after it gets reset, it must go back into management, which has been like how it's been on iOS for a long, long time. So it's a huge improvement for the Mac this year.
Especially for remote workers.
Yeah.
Like that's such a big challenge that so many people have had, is like, how do I send you hardware and make sure it's enrolled? And
yeah, because I think a lot of folks, that are concerned about the lack of mandatory enrollment, a lot of users, when they get their device from the organization, they're not intentionally trying to not enroll in management, but maybe they just skip the Wi-Fi pane, right? Like, oh, I'll do this later, and then they don't get enrolled. I think that's been pain that's been felt by a lot of admins out there. So as long as it's been connected, activated, enrolled once now, going forward, those devices will have to connect to network to re-enroll going forward, which is a really nice change.
Cool. Patrick, thanks for sharing some of the details from your talk. So that was one of 2 sessions about macOS at RSA. I'm curious, as you think about like the rest of what's happening at RSA, if macOS is a small part of it, and you zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture of what's happening at RSA, what trends or themes or topics do you see emerging?
I think just the continued focus on AI, ML, some of the buzzwordy type things, but companies really trying to both scale security, but also do it in a way that doesn't impact users too much or generate too many false positives. I mean, this is something that we've been tried to do for years. I think you made an excellent point that organizations now realize security is so important, and so there's basically blank checks for security products. So the challenge is always, what's the snake oil? What's the good products? You have the players in the space that have been there for a while. I mean, Microsoft has been doing a lot of really interesting security stuff recently. I mean, they always do security stuff, but now, they're doing more even on macOS. And so to me, it's just interesting to see almost all the companies, especially at RSA, having some security components. And so it's really interesting to me just to see that trend, and just confirms that security is and privacy is super important to everybody.
Yeah. Kat, you work for a nonprofit. You don't have anything to sell
I know.
at RSA, which puts you in a little bit of a different position, right? What's your perspective from being at the show and seeing what's being talked about there?
so it's amazing being at a booth and like being like, hey, can I scan your badge? Like, I'm not selling anything. And then they're like, okay, I have a sticker. Like, it was
Great stickers.
It was right. Pascal, you're amazing. And all the attack leads that also help with that concept. I will say, so one thing I noticed at the conference this year was there was definitely a different theme. So when you're walking around these conferences, right, it's always very heavy, like, come buy my stuff, basically, right? It can get a little overwhelming and a little cringy at times. But there was actually, and I always feel like this is very significant, RSA booths are not cheap. Like, at all. Like, I think we're all looking at, like, how much was that? And there was actually a good amount of booths there this time where there was this one where it's like the women quotient, or there was different booths that were actually very focused on diversity and focused on bringing in different voices into the field, where it was more about the culture in which we create and we cultivate in our industry, and not just, I have a product, you should buy it. And I really liked seeing that. So you had mentioned the tracks earlier, like on leadership and mental health. And I've noticed a theme over, I want to say the last 4 or 5 years, where there tends to be a lot of conferences that will actually start having dedicated talks and tracks into what to do with burnout, with what to do with diversity, and how to be able to build talent, how to keep talent. Because I definitely think we're in a retention crisis, at times. Like, not everyone is, obviously, big companies. But for a lot of us, like, we are always trying to keep people. So I liked seeing that theme, where there was this cool bringing about of embracing, like, historical heroes or different faces for things that you would normally just, like, put something very not pink on. I guess you could say. I'm like, what didn't I say? That won't get me in trouble. Not pink.
Yeah. I'm curious. I mean, my perspective is I think the Mac community and the Mac admin community has been committed to diversity and inclusion in a really important way that I've enjoyed through my years and participating in that. And so I think it's great to see that spreading to the security community, and that might be an area where Mac professionals, security professionals are focused on Mac, might be able to help lead the way, right, and create room for more people to come in. That's great. I appreciate that very much. As we talk about these two conferences, I think one of the themes that's really emerged tonight is just that continued growth of Apple in the enterprise, the emergence of Apple and their ability to continue to grow, to win new users. We've seen user choice programs be in organizations, and we've seen really strong adoption where users have a clear preference to use the Apple platform at work. And so as we think about kind of those big trends and maybe look into the future a little bit, I'd like to ask each of you, what do you see as the most important topics for Apple in the enterprise into the future? What do you think will continue to drive their success?
I mean, I can start. I mean, I think, like I said, the efforts that they have in Silicon, I think, are a fundamental reason that, well, one, they're highly differentiated and they can just do things that their competition can't. And the interesting thing is, I'm sure everybody's known for a long time, like Apple's been in the enterprise for a really long time. They've just done it with the iPhone, right? And not all of those are necessarily managed, but often they're allowed to be opted in to specific services. And so Apple's known, like, hey, people use our stuff for work, and we continually see just high amounts of like iMessage as one of the primary ways to communicate with peers in a more one-to-one, two-to-two, not like, like what you do in Slack with 50 or 100 people, but it's like an everyday part of their workflow. And so I think the way that they think about the broad set of experiences that they have, and now they're starting to tie all of those things together. I mean, I think the continuity camera was a really interesting one, because now all of a sudden you've actually got some really cool use cases you can do with your iPhone, with your Mac, in ways that you could not before, and use that for not just better webcam, but demonstrations. You can do whiteboarding and stuff, and so it's pretty wild. I saw you can do whiteboarding and stuff, and so it's pretty wild. I saw it in action. Whenever you get a chance to see it, it's mind blowing. And I think those are the kind of things where they're starting, because again they can control the whole stack. Every experience is deepening in its integration, and all of those devices that they have, whether it's Apple TV, including Apple Watch, if you have all of these things, it will only expand your use cases, both in a consumer and in an enterprise productivity workspace. And so I think it's interesting to look at. You could make a really strong case that, like, oh, hey, to be extremely productive, I need a phone and a Mac and an iPad. And between all these things, I can do more than I did if I just had a phone and a Mac, or if I just had a Mac and an iPad. And so they're building that strength of the ecosystem story. I think, again, it's all driven by the Silicon team enabling a whole host of things that they can track to with software. But that I think creates that compelling case, because who else can do that, right? Microsoft doesn't have a platform. They're trying to partner with Android as close as they can. That's still a schism. Those groups hate each other, but they realize they need each other. And so you just don't have the same player, whereas if you just want the best of all and all these things to work well, adopt Apple's platform. And that's the continued thrust that I think will get IT to just say, look, our employees are going to be better, if we do this. We already know all the TCO stuff. We already know, there's less support tickets on Mac. So it's like those things I think will break that hurdle when now all of a sudden you've empowered your workforce to be even more productive than they could if they were not on these platforms.
I think for me, it's when I think about Apple Enterprise, the word that comes to mind is growth, and it's because Apple themselves continue to invest in the space. So a while back, right, it was generally the C-level in an organization that was requesting to use a Mac, and then IT would kind of have to just make it work and fit it in. But then as more generations of students are coming out of college and they're more familiar with using Apple devices, they want to use those same devices that they're familiar with at home, at work, and that's driven this both top-down and bottom-up influx of devices. And at the same time, we've seen Apple really invest in improving management capabilities and security capabilities. Sometimes those things are a little bit orthogonal to one another, like the security features become a pain for admins to manage, but ultimately at the end of the day, they've done a pretty good job of offering kind of the relief valves through MDM to manage the most security impactful things that were, potentially disruptive for an organization. Like this past year, there were job postings for this new workflow team that was focused on enterprise. Some of you may remember a couple of years ago, there was a workflow team designed just for pro workflows. And that really, over the past couple of years, you can see the shift in the pro hardware, like the Mac Studio that was released, and the driving of Apple Silicon to drive additional performance and optimizations. And so if this new enterprise workflow team can be even just partially as effective as this pro workflow team, I think we'll continue to see incredible benefits to all of us as admins and folks that work in this space for making it easier to adopt these platforms in enterprise. So that excites me, and we saw a lot of that this year even with Declarative and WWDC. So.
What else? What other trends do you see coming for Apple in the enterprise?
I really see them to obviously continue to invest in security, but to me in interesting ways. I think, Ben, you mentioned this, that some of the concern maybe from the internal IT teams about deploying Macs are the visibility. What are these Macs doing? Hey, how do we understand the threats? Is there tooling? And so I think Apple is now really listening to that and enabling third parties to develop very powerful security tools in a way that's conformant with Apple's vision. For example, the endpoint security framework that they recently released. I mean, that was really like, hey, here's a framework for people to write security tools. Like, that was kind of a big psychological shift or for Apple, because before, they said, oh, it's secure, you don't really need to worry about that. And I think the enterprise kind of demanded that, and Apple, to their kudos, listened. And so I think that trend will just continue, because I think Apple has seen that it brings more Macs into the enterprise if the enterprise is like, hey, we now have the tooling and capability, either internally or from other third parties, that give us the insight and the security. So I think that's something that's going to continue to be embraced by Apple. And as someone who writes security tools, that's really, really beneficial. And so I'm happy Apple's going that direction, because it's really a win-win for everybody.
I'll say two trends as far as upcoming, right? Because we're talking about future, which means none of our answers are right. Yeah. So we're clear. Like, we're all guessing here, yep, to the best of our knowledge. I love the transparency from the ESF logger. That, hands down, it is actually what's enabling me to be able to push something into attack that will actually be useful for other people. At least that's our hope. So if it's not, please let me know. And then the other part of that is the user execution is honestly, I happened to be listening to a panel earlier, and there was a comment made regarding user execution about how malware basically tries to trick users into accepting all the TTC, yes, you can have access to this, and yes, you can have access to this. And I would say over the year, that's kind of something that I'm going to be looking into, is how is that play, right? Because in the attack framework, user execution is probably, whether it's through spear phishing, whether it's through actually executing a malicious payload, just like Patrick was saying earlier, right? I downloaded Flash, and then it installed Flash, but it also installed 5 other things, right? So watching that behavior change, because something that I've noticed over the previous years is the different ways to get around a lot of the hardware implementations that Apple's had, right? Getting around the TCC restrictions to where now you can use ARD to be able to do this, and then they'll come back, okay, now you can't use ARD to do this. You can't use it to hijack an SSH session. And so now watching the way that users have to give every single thing a permission and seeing how that'll evolve with malware will be really interesting to see. But the continued visibility into the endpoint security framework, that's money. So kudos, Apple. Great job. Thank you. Because that definitely allows us to be able to okay, now you have the tool, just like what Patrick was saying, to actually be able to go and implement what does this look like for you. Because I know when I used to do threat hunting, the hardest thing in Apple is I could only do point in time. I could never do like a regular collection, a subscription to that. I didn't even know what events to subscribe to. I just knew there was like a million logs everywhere. Some lasted 7 days, some lasted an hour. And like, you're just like praying to God you had the right one. And then you write the note down and pray that someone paid attention to it on Confluence, which no one did. So then anyways, you guys get what I'm talking about. The point is, thank you thank you very much for giving us a consistent data point, right? Because until you have the data, you don't really know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing I think is interesting is pricing. Like one of my theories was they would waterfall the pricing of the M1 Air similar that they do to iPhones in second gen, and that didn't happen. And so I was kind of like, well, that's kind of a bummer because if you launch that thing at $899, you're pretty much just going to crush it. And so now I'm sort of thinking around, well, we know that there will be pretty aggressive promotions on Airs at $999. That's been happening. Those will get more aggressive now, which I think will be interesting, but that again comes back to where they buy them, right? Because I think you'll still see people buy them at Best Buy because Best Buy is going to have a really good deal and it's not going to come from Apple with your business account. So you still have that. If it's purchased at an external location, how do you roll that in? Which I think will be interesting. But now you could even theorize that M3, they'll probably still keep M1 in the lineup at that Air, maybe waterfall that price. And then again, right, then the problem that they have is they're not built to sell 14 million Macs a quarter right now. Like that's HP's number. So they have to scale this at the same time accordingly. I mean, I already think Macs are going to be highly constrained for the next 6 to 8 months, if not longer, with current strategy, let alone adding 4, 5, 6, 10 million in enterprise unit sales a year, which again, they can't do right now. So I think this is why there's a methodical approach, which is good news. But if they tier this pricing, I mean, then it's just how many can they sell?
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because M1 is already so awesome that like having M2, and I saw the charts, I'm like, you're advertising that this is 20, 30% faster, and I have an M1, and like I'm totally fine with it, right? So
you're still gonna buy an M2, right?
Well, maybe. Yeah. Kat, I'm curious about like you mentioned kind of the approvals in TCC, like. This in Ventura, there's yet another approval for launch daemons and launch agents. So I'm curious, like, do you think at some point there's kind of approval fatigue and users just end up saying yes, 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 yes because there's so many? Like, I think it'd be great if Apple consolidated those into like one sheet where it was like, when you try to add an app to Gmail or something and you give it access to your contacts and mail and all of that, if it was one sheet that said camera, microphone, full disk access, and you didn't have to click through 5 or 6 prompts, like. I'd love your perspective on that.
So that's such a tricky question to answer, right? Because it's really, like I find it actually a very powerful tool that you're actually asked when it prompts for it. So when I'm installing the app, right? Or like when I initiated a meeting on Safari that uses my camera and my microphone, then it prompts me for it.
Yeah.
Like those are actually kind of a very powerful tool. At the same time, it 100% is annoying. So like hands down, get that. So I don't know, I think that would be definitely something I think for maybe like on the beginning, on initial installation that you guys could definitely address, like as part of MDM solutions. But and where it's more of an abnormal thing for an app, but.
Yeah, we can help with some of those things. Yeah, camera and microphone are still, I mean, as they should be, honestly, those ones are still required by the user. But.
Yeah, I think there's also the counter, right? Where it's like, so if I do click don't allow, does it actually not allow? Or did it go through already? Like, that's another thing I would want to
dig into.
This whole question of privacy that's come up in the last comments here is a really important trend for the industry. I think Apple has their stance on privacy, but it's been in the news for other large tech companies. This is something that has become more and more relevant to each one of us as our lives become more digital, more intertwined with technology. But that has an interesting intersection with the enterprise as well. So that there's this intersection of user privacy and enterprise control. And so I'm curious about your perspective there. How does the focus on privacy affect the ways that enterprise will adopt technology?
That's a good point because I'm often very critical of Apple's security, but I think they do privacy amazingly. And I think this kind of fits into their business model, right? They sell you a very expensive device. I mean, great devices, but they might not have to recoup it that much. Whereas other companies that give away free services, they got to make their money somewhere, and the common way is track users and show them ads. And so from a privacy point of view, I think Apple is just so far ahead of a lot of the competition. I think they also always put the user first, maybe even in the context of the enterprise. So, there might be some more challenges that either of you two can maybe talk to, where the enterprise might want more insight to what their users are doing, but because of Apple's very stringent user-focused privacy policy, the users are stoked, but maybe the enterprise. You hear a lot of these articles during the pandemic. Some employers are like trying to track users to make sure they're busy, and taking screenshots and stuff like that, which is kind of BS. And it's probably not easy to do on macOS because of all the privacy controls.
Yeah.
So I think it really benefits the users, and I'm wondering if either of you all think there might be some conflict where some enterprises that maybe don't treat their users as well might run into some problems there, which I think is a good thing.
I mean, we definitely hear that feedback from admins, that there's many things that they feel like because the device is owned by the organization, they should kind of have full control, right?
Fair, yeah.
But, and yes, there's some merit to that, but I really do think that Apple has done a relatively decent job of giving those relief valves for the areas where there's really high impactful privacy changes. They don't always happen on time. Sometimes they happen way late in the seed cycle, or sometimes even after the OS ships. Right, and so that's been a challenge for admins, not having enough time to test and make sure that it works. And then there's this panic that happens all summer, can we deploy the new OS? We don't know because there's these privacy challenges. And ultimately, they usually get resolved. And there's more that Apple could do to make it easier for an admin to know what they need to do to make that setting work in the way that it should, right? It's very manual on the admin's part to find the app and the signing identity and put that into MDM. It's a lot of work to get it to work the way they want. But at the end of the day, they can. So it's that trade-off, right?
Sure.
It's possible, it's just maybe not as easy as it could be for an organization.
I think whoever comes up with an insider threat program on macOS is going to be very profitable, because it's already a hard program, and then with Apple's privacy controls, it makes that even harder. So that's honestly my only perspective coming from the red team side of things, where it's I definitely use macOS because it was way more privacy than Windows, which talked.
Yeah, and I think there's two parts of this. There's the point that Mike made, which I think is totally right. I mean, if it's a corporate owned and managed device, there's just going to be some trade-offs you have with that. One, if they're deploying you a Mac, there might be more that then you're going to give them, but that doesn't apply to your iPhone if you brought that in, right? So now there's this hybrid world, and you've seen Apple try to deal with this on Mac a little bit, right, by partitioning your work life from your personal life, and that's should happen, because I would actually argue that in the grand scheme of big enterprise deployments, more people use their Macs for the hybrid of their life, their personal, whereas most people just have a Windows machine, and that's just work, right? So it's a challenging blend, especially if you have other Apple products. So that's one, it's a management thing, it's a security process thing, right? They're just going to be clear that these are the things that we have access to, these are the things that we don't. But even Apple deals with this problem. I mean, there's been a number of things I've had to sit in antitrust-wise, where in discovery, emails have come up, right, from Apple employees, and even within Apple, there are concessions they make when these are managed devices from inside the company. So it's a process, it's a procedure, but I think the key is just that the worker should know where are those lines, and make sure that they fully understand that, so that there's no confusion what can be seen and what can't be seen.
That's a great point.
But didn't they actually separate, if I read all the release notes right, they actually did separate the calendars and everything else, right, from personal data. I actually created the line.
But does everyone do that? That's the thing. How is it managed? It's possible. It's just a matter of how broadly does it get used by the poor person who's just I just want to use this for my work.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a pen tester's number one finding. It's a config issue.
It's a config issue.
User error.
Yeah, that data separation is dependent on how the user enrolls into MDM, and so it also depends on support from their vendor and if they use managed Apple IDs. So the devil's always in the details on these types of things, but the technology is there, and maybe hopefully could evolve even broader.
And I like that it's there.
I like that it's there too.
I think it really shows that they fundamentally understand privacy and make it a priority, which I don't think you can say for a lot of other technologies.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Yes.
Thirds, all the things that.
As we think about, again, looking ahead, We bring this down to the team level or the individual level. If you're a Mac admin or if you're a security professional, what advice would you provide to those people, many of which are in our audience, or that's the profile of our audience here tonight? What advice would you give to those two groups of people for the coming year? And maybe Mike and Ben, I'll ask you maybe to answer the question about an IT professional. What do you think they should be focused on for the next year? And Kat and Patrick, then we'll come to you and ask about what a security professional should be focused on.
The thing that comes to mind is actually testing. So having been on the other side of this for a little while, filing feedback with Apple is incredibly important. And I know that it can be incredibly frustrating for a lot of people because you file feedback and sometimes it goes into the black hole and you don't hear back. But if you are filing feedback with a managed Apple ID into Feedback Assistant, it is going into the dedicated queue for education and enterprise. And if there are highly impactful issues that you discover in your environment, that along with like an AppleCare Enterprise contract is the best way to get them raised and fixed. Even at Kandji, we've had great success filing issues that we found in the OS and have had great responses and dialogue with Apple through Feedback Assistant. And it's really about how you file, make sure that you're following the best practices they have on the website, and test early and often. This past year, they've done seeding like almost every week, and then sometimes it's overlapping seeding, right? So you have to get ready to test this version while you're getting ready to deploy the next one. And it's really important to catch issues, right? Because if you're managing devices and they're all across your organization, you probably have mission critical software and services that you use. And Apple makes changes in dot releases, right? The Python 2 was removed in the spring release. That was a huge change. We all knew it was coming, right? But I don't think we knew it was coming in a spring release. And so things like that, you don't want to be caught off guard. And the best way to not be caught off guard is to do the early testing. I know it takes time, but it is absolutely worth doing.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say there's two contexts to this, right? Depending on your role in Apple admin. So there's in the enterprise side. I mean, we're just continuing to anticipate more and more Macs to show up in the enterprise. So just be prepared for scale. Get processes in order because there will come a tipping point where these things will be on the menu on equal footing with their Windows counterparts, and that's going to dramatically change the landscape. The other side though is I'm super interested with small business because again, this is the wild west when it comes to management. I think more organizations are now realizing that they should do something. They don't know what. They're trying to figure out how many processes, how many procedures they need to put in place. Because again, if you're a 10 or 15 person organization, it's not it's not the most complex environment, but they're not doing anything. And so now that you're seeing a huge amount of organizations who, again, like I said, probably have a lot more Macs being used in business than people realize, start asking these questions, it creates this really interesting opportunity to now start deploying, managing, helping secure, put processes in place. And with SMBs, it's interesting that they're rarely ever going to be a full Mac shop. And so working with them to have equal, an equal environment for both of those, I think is going to be really interesting because they need to support both. They need to be a little bit more flexible. So it's not quite as easy, I think, sometimes as a big corporation. But there's going to be, I think, hosts of small businesses that are all of us going to suddenly start looking for management services, security services, whether internal or out. And like I said, they're not in the same mindset as big enterprises, so there's going to be a lot of education, a lot of learning, a lot of hand-holding. Like, it's going to be some grunt work, but I'm telling you, there are way more Macs and SMBs than people think, and so that just creates this hotbed of that opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Patrick, Kat, what's your advice to security professionals for this year?
Go ahead.
Ladies first.
Wow.
Totally teasing. Sorry.
I like what you mentioned in terms of the education. If we think about what security teams are faced with, we're seeing the adversaries evolve very quickly, both in terms of their preference of targeting Macs and also the techniques they're using. So kind of at the end of each year, I look at the new malware for the year that's targeting macOS. And I believe it was last year or the year before, roughly 50% of the new malware actually had already existed on other platforms that the adversaries had now ported over to target macOS, which makes total sense, right? They already have that code tested, they have the C2 infrastructure, the protocols all laid out. So they can now use open source cross-platform frameworks or fully ported over and run natively on macOS. It just opens up more targets for them. We also talked earlier about how in response to macOS's additional security mechanisms, notarization, Gatekeeper, XProtect, MRT, TCC stuff, the adversaries are now leveraging exploits or just crafting more sophisticated malware. So this means if you're on the security team, you really have to stay abreast of that and really stay on the cutting edge, because if you don't, the adversaries are just going to smoke you. And so that's kind of exciting, right? Because it's like there's always going to be new things to learn, and it's developing quickly. And so, like as a malware analyst, I kind of get excited when there's now 0 days in malware. Like, this is exciting. I don't know if anyone else gets excited about that. I'm a little strange, but it's important now for the security teams to understand that the bar is raised. The adversaries are spending their days, nights, weekends developing very sophisticated capabilities to target, especially now, enterprise users. And we're talking about adware groups that are using 0 days. We're talking about APT nation states that are developing really sophisticated MAC capabilities. So, security teams, really any opportunity you can learn about OS internals, Mac malware, exploits, really dive onto that because the adversaries are just getting better and better and more prolific in response to Mac's proliferation.
So I definitely get excited about that stuff. In fact, I read your blogs almost religiously. So I'm going to tell everyone pretty much to do what I've been working on updating macOS and Linux over the last year and a half, I want to say, for attack. And I would recommend getting familiar as soon as possible with all of the techniques that are done on macOS, because it's not just launch agents and launch daemons. Yes, we see those absolutely, and I love the fact that the ESF logger, I remembered it this time, actually has muting in there, so that way you can mute specific file paths, right? Because obviously, there's different launch agents and launch daemons that need to be able to update themselves, and you really don't want to have all these things being very loud. It's typically a very loud folder anyways. So use that, get familiar with that. But as far as the techniques go, we just released XPC services, right? That is something that if you watched Subjected by the Sea, there was definitely a lot of talks on that. We definitely added all of the malware that Patrick reverses into attack. But I would say the reason why I would steer you that way is because it's a list of techniques that have been done on attack that have been done by adversaries. It's not that it will be done. It's not that it can be done. It's that it has already been done. And if it's already been done, then if you think about the timeline of these things, right? How long does it take for us to deploy a new operating system? Imagine how long it takes for us to discover something, do the research, go through the publication process, write the blog, finally release the blog, and then it goes for us in attack to finally get that blog and then add it in, right? You're looking about a 9-month period at least that this has already been actively done in the wild. And I'd love to say get the latest and greatest, pay attention to all the fancy things that are in the news that you've subscribed to with a very nice vendor. But a lot of times people just don't even know what the fruit is that they're supposed to be paying attention to, let alone the low-hanging fruit. So for those, if you're a security professional, pick a column, pick a tactic, and then work your way down through those techniques and really get to understand those techniques. We actually pour a lot of time in showing you all the different variations of how you can manipulate OSA script, of how you can go through and you can, it's not just exploiting the operating system, right? There's a million procedures underneath that technique. Pay attention to all the other ones that you can actually collect evidence on in your environment. And then you can also couple that with all of the tools that Apple's just released and all of the blogs that the security professionals have. And it's just a really good starting point to start learning, because the reality is, we can't play the ignorance is bliss game anymore. It's actually a thing, and it's just growing. So it's one of those that it's might as well just address it while we can versus wish we did a little sooner.
Thank you for all your advice. Great advice from each of you. Thanks to our panelists, Ben, Kat, Patrick, and Mike. Thanks to all of you for being with us today and for joining us online. It's really been a great year. If you haven't had a chance, be sure to check all the recordings of the great sessions at RSA and the Worldwide Developers Conference. This looks to be a year where we'll continue to see the convergence of both IT and security. Can't wait to see what happens, and hope to see you around. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
too. Awesome.
That's great.
Thanks, man. You're very articulate.
You are very articulate.